Danny Carter sat in the back row of the United Nations Assembly Hall and tried to stay calm, but his hands would not stop shaking. As he adjusted his translation equipment for the third time in 5 minutes, and he knew this was the most important day in human history because aliens had finally made contact with Earth, and not just any aliens, but ones that looked like elves from fantasy stories and rode dragons through space like something out of a fever dream. The alien ship hung above Earth like a giant silver moon, and everyone on the planet had been staring at it for the past week, wondering what these visitors wanted and whether humanity is about to join some galactic community or get wiped out like bugs. And Danny had been chosen to help with translation because he was good with languages and had worked for the UN for 3 years, but nothing in his training had prepared him for what he was about to witness. The holographic projection flickered to life in the center of the assembly hall, and suddenly she was there, and Danny forgot how to breathe because Princess Seraphine was the most beautiful and terrifying being he had ever seen, and she stood 7 feet tall with skin that glowed like moonlight and pointed ears that swept back from her angular face, and her eyes were pools of liquid gold that seemed to see right through everyone in the room, and her hair was white as fresh snow and sparkled with what looked like actual diamond dust woven through the strands. But it was not the princess that made Danny feel like his heart might explode from his chest, and it was the creature coiled behind her that made every person in that room want to run screaming for the exits, because Veermoth the dragon was massive. Even while resting, and his scales were the color of midnight sky but covered in moving constellations, like someone had captured entire galaxies and painted them across living flesh, and his eyes burned like twin suns, and when he breathed small, sparks of starlight drifted from his nostrils, and Danny could feel the intelligence in those eyes and knew this was no dumb beast, but something ancient and aware and extremely dangerous. Danny had expected first contact to be boring, diplomatic, talk and careful treating negotiations, and maybe some awkward cultural exchanges where everyone tried not to offend anyone else, but Princess Seraphine had other plans, and she began speaking in her own language, which the neural translation device converted to English, and her voice was both beautiful and commanding, and filled the entire hall without needing microphones or amplification. Told them that her people were called the Althor Empire, and that they had been fighting a terrible war for 300 years against something called the Void Swarm, and Danny did not like the sound of that name at all because it made him think of darkness and destruction and the end of everything. And Seraphine explained that her people were losing this war, and that their ancient bloodlines were growing weak, and their magic was fading, and soon they would fall, and when they fell, the Void Swarm would spread across the entire galaxy, consuming everything in its path. The Secretary General of the UN stood up and tried to maintain his diplomatic composure, and suggested that perhaps they could discuss an alliance and maybe exchange some information and take things slow and careful. But Princess Seraphine cut him off with a gesture and said that there was no time for slow and careful because the prophecy had already begun, and Veermoth had already started searching for the one who would fulfill it. Danny felt a cold sensation in his stomach because something about the way she said prophecy made him nervous, and he wished he could just sink into his chair and disappear. But then Seraphine explained that according to an ancient prophecy written by the first ones, who had walked among the stars millions of years ago, there was only one way to save both civilizations, and it required a bonding between her people and a younger race, and specifically it required her to take a husband from Earth, and that husband needed to have a spirit strong enough to withstand dragon fire and pure enough to channel new magic through ancient bloodlines. Every ambassador and world leader in that room started talking at once, and some were angry and some were confused and some were just terrified, but Princess Seraphine raised her hand for silence and said that the choosing was not up to humans or even up to her, because Veermoth the dragon would select the one whose spirit called to him. And the dragon could see into souls and read the strength of bloodlines and sense potential that was invisible to mortal eyes. Danny watched in growing horror as Veermoth began scanning the assembly hall, and those burning eyes swept across hundreds of people, and Danny could feel the weight of that gaze even though it had not reached him yet, and it felt like being examined by something vast and incomprehensible, and he wanted to run, but his legs would not obey, and he just sat there frozen in his back row seat, hoping desperately that the dragon would choose someone else, and anyone else, because Danny was just a translator and he was not hero material, and he definitely was not qualified to marry an alien princess or save two civilizations. But then Veermouth stopped, and those burning eyes locked directly onto Danny through the holographic connection, and the dragon roared, and the sound shook the building foundations and made windows rattle in their frames, and threads of light shot out from the dragon body and somehow passed through the hologram itself to illuminate Danny like a spotlight had found him in the darkness, and suddenly every single person in the assembly hall turned to stare at him. Danny felt his tablet slip from his fingers and clatter to the floor, but he could not look away from those burning dragon eyes, and Princess Seraphine looked surprised, and then pleased, and she raised one long, elegant finger and pointed directly at him, and her rings glowed with the same light that covered Veermouth scales, and her voice rang out with power that made the air vibrate, and she declared that Daniel Carter of Earth had been chosen by the stars, and that according to the ancient laws that bound her people, she was declaring her intention to take him as her consort and battle companion. The silence that followed felt like the entire world holding its breath, and Danny could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, and he thought maybe he was having a heart attack or a stroke, or maybe this was all just a terrible nightmare and he would wake up any second. But then his supervisor, Margaret Liu, grabbed his arm hard enough to leave bruises and asked if he understood what had just happened, and yes, Danny understood perfectly, and that was the problem. The Secretary General tried again to suggest that maybe they could discuss this further and perhaps have some negotiations, and certainly there must be some kind of selection process that would be more fair. But Princess Seraphine said there was nothing to discuss because Veermouth had chosen, and the dragon choice was absolute, and she gave Earth 3 days to send Daniel Carter to her ship, or the Althor Empire would consider it a rejection of alliance, and when the Void Swarm reached Earth, and it would definitely reach Earth, then humanity would face it alone without any help or protection. Margaret was shaking Danny now and telling him to say something and do something, but Danny could not think of what to say, because what do you say when an alien princess and her dragon decide you are the chosen one in some ancient prophecy, and the fate of 2 entire civilizations suddenly depends on whether you agree to marry someone you just met 5 minutes ago? Through the holographic connection, Danny met Princess Seraphine eyes, and he saw something there that surprised him, because beneath all that regal bearing and ancient power, she looked desperate and tired, like someone who had been fighting for so long that she barely remembered what peace felt like. And behind her, Veermouth settled back into his coiled position, but those sun-bright eyes never left. Danny and the dragon made a sound that rumbled through Danny's chest, like approval or recognition, or maybe a promise. The assembly hall exploded into chaos, with everyone shouting and arguing and demanding answers, but Danny barely heard any of it because he was still locked in that moment of connection with the princess and the dragon, and he understood with sudden terrible clarity that neither of them had chosen this path either, and they were just as trapped by destiny as he was, but they had accepted it because the alternative was watching their entire civilization die, and now they needed him to accept it too, or Earth would stand alone against an enemy that had brought an empire of space elves and dragons to the edge of extinction 3 days, and that was all the time. Danny had to somehow become whatever this prophecy required, and he was 26 years old and had never even had a serious girlfriend, and now he was supposed to marry an alien princess and help fight an apocalypse and save 2 worlds, and he had absolutely no idea how he was going to do any of that. But as he looked at Princess Seraphine through the hologram and saw the desperate hope in her golden eyes, he knew he could not say no, because saying no meant dooming billions of people on both worlds to death, or worse. Veermouth rumbled again, and this time Danny felt it not just in his chest, but somewhere deeper, like the dragon was already creating a connection between them, and it felt strange and foreign, but also oddly right, like finding a piece of yourself you never knew was missing, and Danny realized that the bonding had already begun, whether he had agreed to it or not, and there was no going back now, even if he wanted to. Margaret was still gripping his arm and asking what he was going to do, and Danny looked at her and saw his own fear. The shuttle ride up to the alien ship felt like the longest journey of Danny's life, even though it only took 30 minutes to reach orbit, and Colonel Amanda Hayes sat across from him with her hand resting on her weapon and kept telling him that he did not have to do this and that Earth could find another way. But Danny knew she was lying because there was no other way. And they both knew it, and outside the viewport the Althor vessel grew larger and more impossible with every passing second. Danny had spent the past 3 days being poked and prodded by doctors and questioned by politicians and briefed by generals, and everyone wanted to know what he was thinking and what his plan was, and whether he was brave or crazy or just stupid. But Danny did not have good answers for any of them, because the truth was he was terrified and had no plan except to not let everyone on Earth die because he was too scared to face an alien princess and her dragon. The alien ship did not look like anything humans had built, and it was all curves and flowing lines, like someone had carved a cathedral from crystal and starlight. And when the shuttle docked, Danny felt a slight vibration run through the hull, and then the airlock opened, and he stepped into another world. The interior of the ship made Danny breath catch because everything glowed with soft light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, and the walls were not metal, but something that looked like solidified. Moonlight and pillars reached up toward a ceiling that showed actual space, not through windows, but as if the barrier between ship and cosmos had simply ceased to exist, and Danny could see stars and nebulas and distant galaxies all spinning overhead, and the whole ship hummed with a frequency he could feel in his bones. Princess Seraphine waited for him in the center of a vast chamber, and she wore armor now instead of the ceremonial robes from the hologram, and it fit her tall frame like liquid silver, and her white hair was bound in an intricate braid woven through with threads of light that pulsed with each breath. And behind her, Veermuth was coiled like a living mountain, and his scales reflected light in ways that hurt to look at directly. And Danny had to fight the urge to turn and run back to the shuttle. Zarafin looked at him, and her golden eyes were softer than they had been during the assembly. And she said she was glad he came, and Danny almost laughed because what choice did he happened. Then he saw the understanding in her face and realized she knew exactly how trapped he felt, because she was trapped too by prophecy and duty and the weight of her dying civilization. Colonel Hayes and her Marines had followed Danny through the airlock with weapons ready, even though everyone knew those weapons would be useless against Dragonfire, and Seraphine barely glanced at them before turning her full attention to Danny, and she explained that Veermuth needed to test him, and not test his strength or fighting skill, but test the quality of his spirit and his soul, because many warriors had strong arms and brave hearts, but the dragon did not care about such things and instead looked for something deeper and more fundamental. Danny asked what would happen if he failed the test, and Seraphine's face became grave, and she said that if he failed, then Earth would stand alone, and her people would fade into extinction while waiting for another prophecy that might never come. And she touched his cheek with her long, cool fingers, and her skin glowed with inner light at the contact. And she said she did not wish to fail, because her people had fought for so long, and she was so very tired. Viremouth uncoiled and moved toward Danny with impossible grace for something so massive, and his head lowered until those burning eyes were level with Danny's face. And this close, Danny could see that the constellation patterns on the dragon scales were not just decorations, but actual tiny stars captured somehow within the living flesh, and miniature suns burning across midnight-colored scales, and the heat radiating from the dragon body made sweat bead on Danny's foreheads. Arafine warned him that Veermuth would look into his soul, and that most people could not withstand it because their minds broke or their hearts stopped from the weight of being truly seen. And Colonel Hayes started to object and raised her weapon, but Seraphine said it was too late because the test had already begun, and she was right, because Danny suddenly felt something vast and ancient crash through all his mental defenses, like they were made of paper. The dragon was in his mind, and Danny could not stop it and could not hide anything. And Veermuth saw everything in Danny, watched his own life unfold like a movie, and he saw his childhood in a small apartment where his mother worked 3 jobs to keep him in school, and he saw the scholarship to university, where he discovered his gift for languages, and he saw the loneliness of being the smartest kid in rooms full of people who did not understand him. And he saw his father leaving when Danny was 6 years old, and the wound that never quite healed, no matter how many. Years passed, but Vermoth went deeper than memories and looked at something more fundamental, and Danny felt the dragon, examining not what he had done, but what he was at his core, and every fear and every hope and every secret shame and hidden strength was laid bare before that eternal gaze, and Danny wanted to scream or cry or run, but he could do none of those things, and instead he just endured while the dragon peeled away. Every layer of his being, then Veermouth showed Danny something, and it hit his consciousness like a meteor strike, and suddenly he was seeing visions that were not his own, and he saw the void swarm, and understanding came with horror. Because they were not aliens or creatures or anything that could be reasoned with, but instead they were entropy given form, and the heat death of the universe given teeth and hunger, and where they passed, stars went dark, and planets crumbled and entire. Civilizations vanished as if they had never existed. Danny saw the Althor Empire, slow retreat across the galaxy, and system after system falling to encroaching darkness. And he saw Seraphine, a young princess watching her parents lead a desperate defense of their homeworld, and he saw that world fall anyway, and he saw her escape with survivors, and he saw the guilt that drove her to keep fighting long after hope should have died. He saw the prophecy too, and not as words but as a feeling and an absolute certainty that two bloodlines must merge, and that ancient magic must combine with young determination to birth something new, and something that could stand against the void. And Danny understood with sudden clarity why Vermouth had chosen him, because the dragon had seen that stubborn human fire that refused to give up. Even when giving up would be easier, the vision ended, and Danny found himself on his knees gasping for air, and his whole body shook from the intensity of what he had experienced, and Vermouth's head pulled back, and the dragon made a sound that was part rumble and part song, and the constellation patterns across his scales blazed with sudden brilliance, and threads of light shot out and wrapped around Danny like gentle chains made of starlight. The light sank into Danny's skin, and he felt something change deep inside his body, and suddenly the chamber came into sharper focus, with every detail crystal clear, and he could hear the ship hummed not just as sound, but as music, and a symphony of energies singing in frequencies he had never been able to perceive before. And when he looked at his hands, he saw faint patterns of light tracing across his skin, and they echoed the constellations on Vermouth scales. Princess Seraphine breathed the word impossible, and her eyes were wide with wonder, and she explained that the bonding had begun, and that Veermouth had not just accepted Danny, but had chosen to share his essence. And she said this had not happened since the first ones walked the stars, and Danny climbed to his feet feeling unsteady, but somehow stronger than he had ever felt in his entire life. Danny asked what it meant, and Seraphine stepped close and took his hand fully in hers, and her grip was firm and warm, and she said it meant he was no longer just human, and that Vermouth had marked him as kin and had begun the transformation that would let him stand in battle beside them, and she said it meant the prophecy might actually come to pass, and there was so much hope in her voice that Danny felt his chest tighten. Colonel Hayes and her Marines were staring with weapons forgotten, and through the airlock Danny could see communication panels lighting up as Earth demanded to know what was happening, and Danny asked how long they had before the void swarm reached Earth, and Seraphine's face hardened, and she said 3 months, perhaps 4, because the swarm moved slowly but thoroughly, and every world in their path fell without exception. Danny looked at Veermouth and at the dragon who had seen into his soul and found him worthy despite all his fears and inadequacies, and he asked when they would start preparing, and Princess Seraphine smiled for the first time since he had met her, and it transformed her face and made her look less like an ancient warrior and more like a young woman given a glimpse of hope after years in darkness. She said they would start now because the bonding must be completed, and he must learn their ways of war, and the void swarm did not pause for courtship rituals. So neither could they, and Veermouth roared his approval, and the sound carried through the ship and through space itself, and it was a declaration that echoed between worlds and announced that the dragon had chosen and the prophecy had begun. Danny Carter took his first steps deeper into the alien ship and away from everything he had known and toward becoming something more than. The training chambers aboard the alien ship defied everything Danny had learned in school about physics and space and reality, because they were not really rooms but pocket dimensions that seemed to expand forever in all directions, while somehow still being contained inside the vessel hull. And Princess Seraphine called them star forges and said they were places where reality could be bent to create perfect conditions for testing. Warriors Danny stood in the center of one such chamber, dripping sweat and breathing hard, and his human clothes had been replaced days ago with adaptive armor that the Althor provided, and it molded to his skin like liquid silver and responded to his thoughts, almost before he had them, in the faint constellation. Patterns that Vermoth bonding had left on his skin glowed through the armor surface and pulsed in time with his racing heartbeats. Often moved like water and lightning combined, and her own armor seemed to flow with her movements instead of restricting them, and the training blade in her hand could cut through steel but would not permanently harm, and it swept toward Danny midsection in a strike that would have killed him. If she had been using a real weapon, Danny tried to block and tried to move, the way she had shown him 1,000 times over the past 2 weeks, and he was faster now than any human had a right to be. Because the dragon essence enhanced his reflexes to superhuman levels, but Seraphine had been training since before Danny. Grandparents were born and experienced trumped enhanced abilities every single time. Blade slipped past his guard and tapped his ribs hard enough to make him grunt in pain, and Seraphine stepped back and said simply that he was dead for the 15th time that session, and Danny bent over with his hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. He pointed out that he had only been doing this for 2 weeks, and asked how long it had taken her to learn, and Seraphine moved to the chamber edge, where Vermouth lay coiled and watching with those burning eyes, and she said it took her 47 years, but they only had perhaps 3 months before the swarm reached Earth's system, and Danny must learn in weeks what took her decades. Danny muttered that there was no pressure, and Vermouth rumbled with what felt like amusement through their bond, and Danny had learned that the dragon had a dry sense of humor that came through in feelings, rather than words, and a deep intelligence that was alien. Yet somehow familiar. Seraphine told him to come, and that he needed rest, and they had other matters to discuss, and she led him through the ship, crystalline corridors to her personal chambers, and Danny had been here several times over the past weeks, usually for tactical briefings or cultural lessons, and the room was vast and filled with artifacts from hundreds of worlds the Althor had visited or defended. What drew Danny's eye was the star map that dominated the center of the chamber, and it floated in midair as a 3-dimensional representation of the galaxy rendered in light, and what looked like captured stardust in red. Markers showed the void swarm advance like a spreading cancer that had already consumed 1/3 of the galaxy. Spiral arms. Seraphine gestured, and blue light illuminated thousands of systems, and she said this was the Althor Empire at its height, and it was 500,000 worlds where her people walked, in a civilization that had stood for 1,000,000 years. And then she made another gesture, and the blue contracted and withered away as the red advanced, and she said this was them now, with only 17,000 worlds, and most of them evacuated and used only as military outposts and are retreating. Danny studied the map, and his enhanced perception let him track invasion patterns, and he said aloud that the swarm was not spreading randomly but following something, and Seraphine's eyes widened, and she asked how he could see that, because it took their greatest strategists centuries to identify the pattern. Danny touched his forehead and explained it was the dragon gift, because he saw things differently now and could spot patterns in chaos and connections between disparate facts. And he pointed to the map and said the swarm was following old energy signatures, because the Althor Empire was ancient and had left marks on space itself wherever they traveled, and the swarm tracked those marks like bloodhounds following a Senseraphini. Said quietly that this meant by coming to Earth and making contact with humans, they may have doomed Danny world, because the swarm would sense their presence there, and the weight of that realization hung between them like a physical thing. Danny asked her to tell him about the prophecy, and not the public version she gave Earth leaders, but the real one, And Seraphine was quiet for a long moment before moving to a cabinet carved from what looked like petrified moonlight, and she removed an ancient data crystal that pulsed with inner light. When she activated it, words appeared in the air, and they were not in English or any Earth language, but Danny found he could read them anyway, because that was another gift of the bonding, and he read aloud about starfire dimming and void hunger spreading, and when the eldest children stumble in darkness, salvation shall come from the youngest, and not in strength of arms or wisdom of ages, but in the stubborn fire of those who have not yet learned they should despairs. Alpheus explained that the first ones wrote this 10 million years ago, before her people evolved, and before most current galactic civilizations existed, and they saw the void swarm coming and saw it would return again and again across the eons, and they left instructions for how to fight it. Danny understood suddenly and said it was about creating hybrids by mixing ancient magic with humanity, and he asked what humans had that the Althor did not, and Seraphine said simply that it was hope, because human people had known civilization for perhaps 10,000 years and had not yet experienced the weight of deep time and the way it crushed optimism in humans. Still truly believed that any problem could be solved and that tomorrow would be better than today. She stepped closer, and Danny could see the exhaustion in her eyes and the weariness of someone who had fought too long without victory, and she explained that when Virmouth chose Danny, he saw that fire and that human stubbornness that refused to accept defeat even when defeat was inevitable. And that was what the prophecy required, which was ancient power combined with irrational hope. Danny said their marriage was not just political theater, but was supposed to literally create something new, and Seraphine confirmed it and said the prophecy spoke of offspring who would carry both bloodlines and would be able to wield old magic with new spirit and become a generation of warriors who could stand against the void where the Althor had failed. Danny let that sink in, because he was 26 years old and had never even had a serious girlfriend, and now he was supposed to father a new race of dragon-bonded warriors to fight an apocalypse, and the absurdity would have made him laugh if the stakes were not so high. Seraphine said she was afraid, and Danny read her expression, and she admitted she was terrified, but not of battle or death, but of failure, because if this did not work, and if the prophecy was wrong, or they had misinterpreted it, then she would watch her people march into extinction while clinging to false hope, and she would have dragged Danny whirled down with hers. Virmouth's presence surged in Danny's mind, and the dragon projected confidence and certainty, because the creature had seen something in Danny and had chosen him for reasons he still did not fully understand, but the bond worked both ways, and Danny could feel Virmouth's absolute conviction that the prophecy was true. Danny said they had better make sure it worked, and then alarms suddenly shrieked through the ship, and the sound cut through crystal corridors like a knife through flesh, and Seraphine's expression went from vulnerable to warrior in an instant, and her armor surface patterns shifted to combat configuration. She commanded battle stations, and her voice projected to the entire ship through technology. Danny was still trying to understand, and she looked at him with grim determination and said his first test came early, because the Void Swarm had found one of their outpost worlds, and they were the closest response fleet. Through the viewport, reality tore open as the ship dropped out of its folding corridor early, and a planet hung before them with beautiful blues and greens marred by spreading patches of absolute darkness, and ships dotted the space around it, with sleek Althor vessels engaging something that hurt to look at. Directly, Danny realized that Void Swarm ships were not really ships at all, but holes in space and absences of existence that moved with terrible purpose, and where they touched matter, that matter simply ceased to be and unraveled at the molecular level. Seraphine said Virmouth name, and the dragon uncoiled and moved toward a platform that would take him to the ship dragon deployment bay, and she looked at Danny, started to say he should stay in the command center to observe and learn, because he was not ready, but Danny interrupted her and surprised himself with the certainty in his voice. And he said no, because if he was supposed to be her battle companion and her consort in war, then he needed to be in the battle, and he added that Virmouth agreed through there. Danny felt the dragon approval as a warmth spreading through his chest, And Seraphine searched his face and then slowly nodded and said to come with her and she would show him. How an Althor princess fought, they ran through the ship together, heading toward the deployment bay where Veermoth waited with wings that could wrap around mountains. Riding a dragon into combat was nothing like Danny had imagined, and there was no saddle or reins or any physical mechanism of control, and instead, Veermoth movements were guided by thought and intention flowing through their bond, and it was a partnership. So intimate that Danny could feel the strain in the dragon muscles as his own, and could sense the tactical calculations happening in that vast alien. Mind the Void's swarm forces surrounded the dying world like a cancer, and their knot ships moved through space with movements that hurt to track because they were not subject to momentum or inertia, and they simply were somewhere. And then were somewhere else with reality bending around them, rather than them moving through reality. Commanded Danny to focus, and told him not to look directly at the Void ships, but to use his peripheral vision and his bond sense because the BHR swarm existed partially outside normal space-time, and direct observation only confused the mind, and Danny tried to follow her advice and let his enhanced perception guide him instead of his eyes through Veermoth, since as the battlefield took on new dimensions and Danny could feel the Void ships as absences and as holes in the fabric of existence that pulled at everything around them like gravity wells, and Veermuth dove, and Danny stomach lurched as the dragon folded space around them and appeared instantly 2 miles from their starting position. The dragon maw opened, and starlight poured out. And it was not metaphorical starlight, but actual stellar fire, and the same nuclear fury that powered suns, and the beam caught one of the Void ships, and for a moment light and darkness collided in a spectacular display. The Void ship unraveled, and its not-existence could not maintain coherence in the face of such concentrated reality. But 3 more appeared where it had been, and they converged on Veermoth from different angles, and Danny felt the dragon alarm through their bond. Seraphine shouted for Danny to channel what he felt to Veermoth and to let the bond amplify his emotions, and Danny did not fully understand what she meant, but instinct took over and he reached deep into a place inside himself where the dragon essence had taken root and found that stubborn human fire that refused to accept defeat, pushed it out through the bond and fed his determination and hope and irrational certainty into Veermoth. Being in the effect was immediate and dramatic, and the constellation patterns across Veermoth's scales blazed brighter with new stars igniting in the dragon hide when Veermoth breathed fire again. It was different and still. Starlight but shot through with something else, and a quality of existence that was uniquely human, and where that mixed fire struck the Void, ships did not just unravel, but recoiled, as if burned by something that contradicted their fundamental nature. Seraphine breathed the word impossible, but Danny heard the fierce joy in her voice, and she said the prophecy manifested, and that Danny was channeling human essence through ancient dragon fire and creating something the swarm had never encountered before. Around them, other Althor ships engaged the swarm forces, and sleek cruisers fired beams of concentrated reality, trying to anchor space-time enough to prevent the Void ships from phase shifting, and dragon riders like Seraphine wove between enemy vessels, breathing starfire and cosmic lightning. But for every Void ship destroyed, 2 more seemed to emerge from the patches of absolute darkness spreading across the planet. Belladony realized with horror that the swarm was consuming the world and not invading it, but literally unmaking it. And Seraphine confirmed grimly that the Void swarm did not conquer, but erased, and every atom of matter they touched was returned to the quantum foam from which it emerged. And even if they drove the swarm off, that world was dead with billions of souls already gone, and unmade so completely that even their possibility of having existed was threatened. The tactical situation deteriorated as Danny watched, and an Althor cruiser took a direct hit from a Void beam, and the entire front half of the ship simply ceased to exist, with no explosion and no debris, but just there one moment and not there the next, as if reality had forgotten the ship. Ever had a forward section? Donnie said they were losing, and Seraphine replied that they were always losing because that was the nature of this war, and every battle was a retreat, and every victory merely determined which worlds they could evacuate before they fell. But today they would learn, if the prophecy could change that equation, they dove toward the planet's surface, and toward the largest concentration of void ships Danny had seen yet, and hundreds of them clustered around what his enhanced senses told him had once been a major city, but was now just spreading darkness that consumed buildings and people and history with equal indifference. Donnie asked what they were doing and felt. Vermouth, determination through the bond, and the dragon was afraid, and that emotion came through clearly, but the dragon was also resolved, and they were going to attempt something. Dangerous Seraphin said they were testing Danny limits and possibly saving a few million souls in the process, and she turned her head slightly so her golden eyes met his, and she asked if he trusted Heron the 2 weeks they had spent together. Danny had learned many things about Princess Seraphine, and she was a warrior without peer and a tactician who could think 3 moves ahead of her enemies, and a woman, carrying the weight of her dying civilization with a grace that humbled him. And she was also stubborn and reckless when she thought the gamble was worth it, and driven by guilt that came from watching too many worlds. Faldani said he trusted her, and Seraphine told him to feed everything he had into Vermouth, and not just his determination, but his memories and his experiences and his very humanity, and to let the dragon become a conduit for human essence on a scale they had never attempted. Danny understood what she was asking, and it would be like opening a vein directly into Vermouth being and channeling not just emotion, but his entire existence through the bond, and it could kill him, and even if it did not, there was no guarantee his mind would survive. Intact below them, another section of city vanished into void, and Danny thought about how many people that was, and thousands or tens of thousands, all gone and erased so completely that the universe itself would eventually forget they had existed. Danny said to do it, and he closed his eyes and reached deep and deeper than he had ever gone into the bond before, and he found that place where he ended and Vermouth began, and that boundary that had seemed so clear, and he pushed past it. Memories flooded through the connection and his mother face when he got the scholarship, and the first time he translated an ancient text, and felt the thrill of bridging languages and centuries, and the loneliness of being different and of never quite fitting, and the wonder of seeing Earth from orbit for the first time, and the fear and determination when Vermouth had first looked into his soul. But Danny went further and channeled not just individual memories, but the weight of human history flowing through his veins, and millions of years of evolution, and of ancestors who had climbed down from trees and looked up at the stars and wondered, and thousands of years of civilization, and humans building and failing and building again, and the stubborn insistence that tomorrow could be better, and that problems could be solved, and that hope was not just permissible but mandatory. Vith roared, and the sound was different this time, and it carried harmonics that had never existed in dragon song before, and frequencies that spoke of something new being born, and the constellation patterns across his scales did not just brighten, but multiplied, with new stars igniting until the dragon seemed to wear the entire galaxy on his hide. When Vermouth breathed, what emerged was not just starfire, but existence itself, and concentrated into a beam that carried the weight of humanity refusal to be erased. And the breath struck the void darkness, consuming the city, and reality reasserted itself. Buildings that had been half unmade suddenly snapped back into coherence, and people who had been vanishing reformed, and they were confused but alive, and the void ships in that sector recoiled like living things burned by acid, and their not-existence could not withstand such concentrated insistence. On being Seraphin, commanded Danny to hold it for just a few seconds more, and let her guide their mouth flight, and her voice was strained, and the dragon swept across the city with Danny pouring everything he was into that impossible breath, and entire districts snapped back from the void edge and were saved from erasure, and void ships fled before them, unable to maintain their coherence. But the cost was devastating, and Danny felt himself unraveling, and his sense of self fragmenting as more and more of his essence channeled through the bond, and he was Danny Carter, but he was also Vermouth. But he was also every human who had ever refused to give up, and the boundaries blurred and dissolved and threatened to disappear entirely. Command cut through the dissolution, and she shouted for him to pull back now, and she physically reached back and grabbed Danny. Arm, and her touch was like an anchor to reality, and with effort that felt like tearing himself in half, Danny withdrew. From the deep bond, he gasped, and his consciousness snapped back into his own body with a shock that made him retch, and only Seraphine grip kept him from falling off Veermouth's back, and the dragon was exhausted, and Danny could feel that much, and they had accomplished something unprecedented, but it had pushed all three of them to their limits. Below them, perhaps. A quarter of the city had been saved, and millions of Earth hung before them like a blue jewel against the darkness, and Danny felt his heart clench at the sight of home, because it had been 6 weeks since he left, and 6 weeks of training and battle and transformation, and the planet looked peaceful from orbit, but Danny could see what others could not yet see, and those were the shadows at the edge of the solar system, moving through the outer planets like predators stalking prey. The void swarm would arrive within days and not months, as they had hoped, and something had accelerated their advance and drawn them toward Earth faster than any previous invasion, and Seraphine believed it was the bond itself and the unprecedented joining of human and dragon that blazed like a beacon to entities that existed partially outside normal reality, stood beside Danny in her chambers aboard the flagship, wearing not battle armor but ceremonial robes that flowed like captured starlight, and her white hair had been woven with crystals that chimed softly with each movement, and for the first time since he met her, she looked more like a bride than a warrior. She asked if Danny had second thoughts, and Danny tried for levity and asked about which part, and whether it was fighting an apocalypse, or marrying an alien princess, or fundamentally changing what it meant to be humans. Arfini's eyes were serious, and she said any of it, and that they could still call this off, and she could face the swarm alone, and Earth could do something else. But Danny shook his head and asked, what Earth could do, because running and hiding would not work, and the swarm was coming regardless, and at least this way they fought back with something the swarm had never faced before. The past weeks had proven the concept, and in 3 more battles across different worlds, they had demonstrated that. Danny channeled human essence, enhanced Veermouth fire in ways that could drive back the void, and other dragon riders had begun training with human volunteers trying to replicate the bond, and so far none had achieved what Danny and Veermouth shared, but that might change. Danny took Seraphine hand and said he had gotten used to her, and it would be a shame to back out now, and Seraphine lips corked in that small smile he had learned to treasure, and she said he made it sound so romantic. Danny said he was working with limited time, and to give him a few centuries and he would get better at it. And Seraphine's smile faded, and she said Danny must understand what he was giving up, because the bonding had already extended his lifespan, and he might live 1,000 years now, but he would watch his homeworld age and change, and his species evolve, and everyone he knew would die while he remained. Danny said then he had better make those centuries count, and a chime echoed through the ship as the assembled fleet signaled readiness, and thousands of Althor vessels surrounded Earth now in a defensive perimeter that Danny knew would not hold if the swarm arrived in full force, but it would buy time for evacuation and for the plan they had spent weeks preparing. Seraphine said she should go too, Veermouth, because the ceremony required certain rituals, but Danny said he knew because he had studied Althor bonding rituals until his enhanced brain could recite them perfectly, and the ceremony was not just symbolic but would deepen the connection between him and Seraphine and Veermouth, and create a 3-way bond that the prophecy claimed would birth something new. Danny watched her leave, and then moved to the viewport and looked at Earth and home, and down there his mother was probably watching the news and terrified by the alien fleet in orbit, and the warnings that had finally been issued. And evacuation procedures had begun, with billions of people moving to designated safe zones that might or might not matter if the swarm came. Admiral Kate Morrison entered the chamber, and she was one of the few humans still aboard the fleet, and a grizzled career officer who had volunteered to serve as liaison between Earth forces and the Althor fleet, and she asked if Danny should not be preparing for the defense. Danny asked why she was here, and Morrison said she wanted to check on their secret weapon first, and she moved to stand beside him, looking out at Earth, and said there were people down there calling Danny a traitor and saying he sold out humanity to alien monsters. Danny said he knew because he had seen the broadcasts and the conspiracy theories and the fear and anger, and Morrison said there were others calling him a hero and saying he was humanity's last hope, and that her daughter was one of them, and she was 13, and told Morrison she wanted to be like Danny. When she grew up and wanted to bond with the dragon and fight the darkness, Morrison said her daughter did not understand what Dani was giving up, but Morrison did, and she wanted to say thank you before things got too crazy and before Dani could respond. Alarms shrieked through the ship, and Morrison communicator lit up, and her expression went hard. She said they were here, and that swarm forces were detected at the heliopause, and the count was thousands of them, and Dani enhanced senses reached out and felt through vermouth awareness across the distance between them, and the dragon was in the deployment bay and could sense what Dani sensed, which was reality beginning to tear at the edge of the solar system, with holes opening in space-time. As the void swarm emerged, Dani told Morrison to get to her station and said this was it, and he ran through the ship corridors with his enhanced body covering distance at speeds that would have seemed impossible weeks ago, and the constellation patterns across his skin blazed with intensity, reflecting Viremouth excitement and fear through their bond. He met Serafini at the deployment bay where Viremouth waited, and the dragon had grown since the bonding began, or perhaps Dani simply perceived his true size now. And Viremouth was vast, with scales of midnight sky, carrying galaxies across his hide, and wings that could block out suns spreading. White Seraphin was already armored with her ceremonial robes abandoned, and she said no ceremony, and they would bond in battle as the first ones did. And Dani said that worked for him, and they should save the world first and have the wedding. After, Viremouth's amusement rumbled through the bond with dark humor that spoke of how many times the dragon had faced impossible odds, but there was something else too, and a fierce pride that Dani had learned to recognize, because the dragon believed in him, and believed they could accomplish what the prophecy promised. The bay doors opened, and they launched into space, and the battle that greeted them was hell, with void ships swarming through the outer solar system like locusts in reality, breaking down wherever they passed, and Saturn rings were already fragmenting, with the beautiful ice structures beginning to unmake themselves as void corruption spread. Althor fleet engaged with everything they had, using starfire and reality anchors and weapons that bent physics, but the swarm kept coming, wave after wave. Seraphine commanded them to focus on the vanguard, because if they could break the leading edge, they could slow the advance of Viremouth. Dovin space folded around them, and they emerged in the middle of a cluster of void ships impossibly close, and the dragon breathed, with Dani feeding everything he had into that breath, which was hope and determination and humanity. Stubborn refusal to be erased. The effect was dramatic, with void ships unraveling and their not-existence unable to maintain coherence, but more kept coming, and phase shifting in from deeper space, and emerging from the tears and reality that their passage created. Dani said it was not enough because there were too many, and Seraphine replied that they must go deeper, and they would both channel their essence together and become the bridge the prophecy described. Dani understood what she meant, and last time he had almost lost himself channeling through Vermouth alone, and this would mean opening completely to both dragon and elf, and letting all three of their essences merge and amplify each other, and it could burn them all out or leave them dead, or worse than dead, which was void touched and partially erased from existence around them. Earth defense grid activated, with missiles launching from the planet's surface and kinetic weapons that could not hurt the void ships but might slow them, and the UN assembled space fleet engaged with primitive fusion drives, pushing them into battle against an enemy they barely understood. Dani said to do it, and he felt Seraphine agreement and her determination matching his own, and they both reached deep into the bond, past all barriers and boundaries, and opened themselves completely. Dani felt Seraphine essence flood into him, and it was ancient beyond measure and weighted with the memories of a million-year civilization, and he experienced her childhood on a world now void touched, and her training under masters who had fought this war for centuries, and her parents' death holding a defensive line long enough for their people to evacuate, and he felt her guilt and her determination and her desperate, barely acknowledged hope that maybe finally something could change. In return, Seraphine experienced Dani humanity and the raw, bleeding optimism of a species that had barely learned to walk upright before reaching for the stars, and she felt his mother love and his father abandonment and his lonely friend. Childhood surrounded by books and languages, Nobody else read, and she experienced humanity history of failure and rebuilding, and of falling and getting up again, and of looking at impossible odds and trying any way through. Fear Moth. Both essences amplified and merged, and the dragon became not just a conduit, but a crucible, taking ancient magic and new spirit and forging something unprecedented. When Vermouth breathed this time, what emerged was not just enhanced,